Okay, this is an audio review for the article Interpreting and Experiencing Anti-Queer Violence, Race, Class, and Gender Differences Among LGBT Hate Crime Victims by Doug Meyer. All right, so before we get started, I just wanted to define what a hate crime is, which is just a crime that's typically a violent crime that's motivated by prejudice on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or other cultural grounds, right? So typically, it's based on one of these social inequalities that we've talked about in this course. Actually, I'm going to post in your additional resources a link to Democracy Now! Broadcast talking about the uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans in the context of the coronavirus, and especially the connection of Trump talking about the virus as the Chinese virus and how that has implications or is related to upticks in hate crimes. So anywho, let's get into the article. So in the article, the author talks about the psychological effects of hate crimes. So these crimes are obviously, they can be often very violent crimes or resulting in death, but they also cause lots of trauma, right? Psychological trauma, and often communicate to the entire community that they're under some sort of threat. Right? So when, white supremacists attack people in a mosque or a synagogue, then that doesn't just, attack that particular group of people. That also makes other people within the religious community fearful, right? Or, when you talk about race or ethnicity, or the fact that, so many trans people, especially, trans women of color, have been killed in the U.S. this year, and there's so little media coverage, there's so little information about these things, when, that is a very, very small population, but has a much higher mortality rate, largely due to these kinds of hate crimes, right? So when you think about how hate crimes work, there's a psychological effect on the victim, and then there's a psychological effect on the community. So the fact that we haven't really focused on the psychological effects of hate crimes in the larger society, or even really just in individuals themselves, means that there's things we don't really understand about hate crimes. So the researcher chose to take an intersectional approach. And again, they define intersectionality as examining the ways in which race, class, gender, and sexuality structure victims' experiences of hate-motivated violence. So as we know little about how these are related to hate crimes, or how they structure victims' experiences, but intersectionality theory denotes the ways in which institutional power structures, such as race, class, gender, sexuality, how they simultaneously structure social relations. And so the theory conceptualizes that institutional power structures are these distinct but mutually reinforcing systems of oppression, right? So if you look at them separately, you miss the connections between them, but they are still institutionally structured and still separate of each other, yet complicatedly intertwined, right? So bringing an intersectionality approach to hate crime research is very important, as criminological research has failed to account for hate-motivated violence. When using an intersectional framework, we can incorporate the power relations. So hate crimes can be understood as a social control mechanism that's rooted in institutional power structures, so that hate crimes are seen as an outgrowth of this system of oppression. So using this approach allows victims to also explain their understandings of hate-motivated violence, which is also an interesting and important thing. All right, so the research itself, getting into the nitty-gritty. So in the methods, this was qualitative research, right? So 44 participants were asked about, these are 44 participants who themselves experienced violence. And that was due to the perception that they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So the author made sure that his sample was diverse and had different racial and ethnic groups represented, different education levels, right? So made a conscious effort for these things. And so in the results, he reported that many respondents were victimized because they violated social gender norms, referring to that and not their sexuality. So this is, again, interesting in that intersectional approach, right? Of how how we define and expect gender roles and expectations also connects to what kind of ideas we have about sexuality. So, and the punishment for violation of each one has social consequences, right? So basically they found that most queer people in the study interpreted the hate to be about their sexuality, even though their sexuality might not be explicitly mentioned, and it might be more about a gender performance. And there were differences along racial lines when it came to results. So for queer people of color, the issue is more complicated than an issue with just their sexuality, meaning that they were unsure if it was their sexuality or maybe their race that was the catalyst for the hate crime. For whites, they saw the hate crime as firmly rooted to their sexuality. So we see how, racial privilege affects that and really just complicates the lived experiences of prejudice for, queer folks of color that might not really be able to say exactly where that, prejudice is coming from because of the diversity of, and just the complicated nature of, prejudice. They also found differences among lesbian women of color and gay men of color, meaning for men who faced hate crimes, many stated the violence took place after a specific homophobic slur, while for lesbians of color, they were more frequently receiving misogynistic comments before the hate crime. So for some women, it was explicitly both. Like her respondent who was sexually assaulted in the hate crime, where the perpetrator insinuated that the attack would affect her sexual identity. So this suggests that the gender of the victim and the perpetrator do affect the degree to which victims confront homophobic insults. And there was, of course, another interesting result was the effects of social class on whether queer people expressed uncertainty. So middle and upper class participants were more willing to see their experiences as rooted in homophobia than the poor participants in the study. So many of the poor participants did not see the violence against them as rooted in homophobia until they were really interviewed versus those of higher social classes who reported that they did. So there might be a privilege aspect there. There might just be the issue of experiencing more hardship, victimization in poor communities, right? Lack of resources, lack of, support system. So that could be what some of those impacts are. And so in the discussion section, they discuss how it's important to look through an intersectional lens so you can see how different members of the LGBTQ community experience hate crimes differently. Because if we're going to understand these things and try to apply solutions and really advocacy beforehand and, resources for people who have been victimized, then we kind of have to understand, like in this perspective, they're saying that depending on your level of marginality, you might not even really conceive of yourself as a victim of a hate crime, even though that's what it is. More so, the more privileged someone is, the more likely they're going to advocate for themselves and see it as, a crime against them based on prejudice. So, it is interesting to see how, our own social position affects the way we view the world, but also affects the way we interpret and experience hate crimes.